new space. And I have a graduate student, Elizabeth Palchek, at the University of Vermont, who's a PhD candidate who's working with me, who is exploring the divestment movement, and really looking specifically at the justifications that different organizations are putting forward of why they are investing or why they're not divesting. And so that's the research that I'm going to present today. And it's very preliminary. We have not yet published any of this, and we're still in it's a very dynamic space, so a lot is actually changing quite quickly. But it's a very interesting area to be exploring. So with that, I guess next slide. The fossil fuel divestment movement is broad and growing rapidly. It really kind of began just in the 2012 or so with the 350.org campaign. And then it ramped up in college campuses in 2013. And now, we're only 2 years beyond that. It's considered the fastest growing divestment movement in history, with more than 460 different kinds of institutions divesting. And that's beyond universities, and I'll show that in a minute. But really, it's really gaining steam and moving quickly, and a lot is happening quickly. Next. So this slide just shows the overall divestment movement, and this is from gofossilfree.org, where they estimate $2.6 trillion has actually been divested, intentionally taken out of fossil fuel investments. And you can see on the side here the percentage of what organizations are that are taking out, that are contributing to this divestment movement. And it says faith-based groups, about 29%, foundations, 25%, pension funds, 13%, and colleges and universities are only 10% of the total movement. Colleges and universities are only 10% of the total movement, but we're going to be, we're paying the most attention to the colleges and universities, but it's part of a larger effort, obviously, and it's getting beyond the colleges and universities as well. Next slide. I like to think about this area of exploration and the divestment movement as really a part of the renewable energy transition. My own research is really focused in this transition studies field, thinking about social and technical systems that are transitioning, and we're really in my view, we're in the midst of a transition away from fossil fuels toward renewable energy, and it's happening in different places, in different ways, and at different speed, and we don't know exactly how it's all going to play out, but ultimately we are going to transition away from fossil fuels to a renewable-based energy systems. So I situate this fossil fuel divestment movement as part of that trend. One of the things we know from studying transitions is that resistance to change and the maintaining the status quo is very strong, and they're powerful forces that are trying to keep things the way they are. But when there's pressure for change aligned at multiple scales and from multiple directions, that's when we see real change and transitions happening. And that's what I propose, that the fossil fuel divestment movement is aligning with pressure from lots of other places and lots of other opportunities and things, opportunities for change, but it's part of this larger transition. Next. One of the things we expect when we study transitions is that they're necessarily disruptive. The whole point, the whole idea of a transition is it's moving from one stable system to another, and we can't expect that kind of a transition to be smooth necessarily. So there's a lot of tension in this transition, and some of the tension and the controversy about fossil fuel divestment, it kind of represents this disruptive nature of the transition. And I guess I'll also just point out quickly here that my research team and the way we explore and focus on the energy transition is really thinking about the energy system transition is not a simple technological substitution. Moving from fossil fuels to renewables obviously is not just switching out the technology or the fuels. There's deep social, political, economic, and cultural change that's also associated with that transition. And that's where also the fossil fuel divestment movement is part of this deeper political and economic change that's happening. So next slide. Very quickly, just to give you context, my research more broadly is focused on diverse perspectives of energy system change and different perspectives of the role of social versus technical change, centralization versus decentralization, and also highlighting the opportunities for broader civic engagement in energy systems more broadly. So, and that was the book that was just published earlier this year that James mentioned. Next slide. And finally, just again to give context for why I'm studying this, I've also done quite a bit of work thinking about the role of universities in the renewable energy transition. Universities generally do teaching and research, but universities also act as a model for society and also have unique opportunities for engaging beyond the university with communities as unique anchor organizations. So the divestment movement and the university role in the divestment movement is particularly interesting because it's a different mechanism for universities to engage in the renewable energy transition. Next. So in thinking about the fossil fuel divestment movement, this recent paper looked kind of historically at divestment movements of other kinds and identified 3 waves of divestment. The first wave, as you can see here, it's often religious groups and industry-related public organizations that start out, and then universities and some cities and select public institutions get involved, and then the wider divestment recognition really happens in this third wave. And so divestment from tobacco and South African companies followed this same pattern. And it's the third wave that moves to this bigger global context and begins targeting larger funds and more the norm. And that's where the fossil fuel divestment movement is likely moving into that third phase, or it probably will soon. Next. When we think about the fossil fuel divestment strategy, there's been, there's different controversy about whether or not how big the impact really could be on fossil fuel corporations, and this paper really talks about how a large potential of the impact is really more to do with stigmatization rather than the actual financial implications. Next slide. So, given that context, this is the work that my graduate student and I have been working on, kind of providing, looking at some of the specific organizations and the high-profile organizations that have either divested or responded to pressure from their campuses to divest by saying, no, we're not going to divest, and this is why. So this slide, I know that the text is small here, but basically the first university was College of the Atlantic in 2013 that divested, and the little yellow triangles are universities or organizations that have in fact divested. Then there are a host of organizations that didn't divest fully from fossil fuels, but they did say they'll divest from coal. And actually another group that said coal and tar sands they will divest from, but not all fossil fuels. And then there are organizations that decided not to divest, but they did issue a public statement explaining their position and justifying their decision. So we've been looking at those public statements to see how universities and colleges and organizations are justifying their decision to divest or not divest. So this is a timeline, this figure, just showing kind of over the past 2 years, really, when and how these different universities have made statements, either saying they are going to divest from all fossil fuels, they're going to divest just from coal, or they're not going to divest. And you can see there's, it's quite well spread out over the past 2 years, but there is more and more. It seems like there's a ramping up to some degree with activity more recently too. Next slide. So what we did was, what we've been working on is analyzing these public statements that the universities and the organizations have put forward. And in specific, we have selected 46 of the most prominent organizations, most of the universities that have divested or made statements about divesting, and analyzed those statements, had a look at them and see what is it, how are the institutional spokespeople, the presidents, the CFOs, or the chancellor, what are they saying? How are they framing the organization's decision either to divest or not to divest? And we analyzed, of these 46 prominent organizations, 31 of them did divest in some form. And I'll explain that in a minute, the different kinds of divestment. And then 15 of the 46 that we looked at released a public statement saying that they decided not to divest. But we also looked at those public statements to understand why and what is the justification. And this is just a figure here, a representation of a New York Times article about the Rockefeller Foundation, which is one of the largest foundations that has divested, which is a prominent and impactful decision. Next slide. So of the 31 organizations that did divest in the past couple of years, there were 4 different kinds of divestment that we've characterized here. 20 of those organizations did full fossil fuel divestment. 5 of them just divested from coal. Another 5 divested from coal and tar sands. And then one organization, the Australia National University, divested simply from mining corporations. That included coal, but also some metal mining. So that's a slightly different category. Next slide. So if we look at the justifications for these organizations who did take positive step in making a stance and divesting, we can see that some of the justifications are clearly, impacts on climate change on future generations, consistency with their mission or their values as organizations that have public good and sustainability or and education and looking out for the future in their value system. Leadership was mentioned by many of them also, that they wanted to be leaders in this transition or in the movement away from fossil fuels. And critically, many of them coupled their divestment strategy with a reinvestment strategy, meaning that they took money out of certain places and out of the fossil fuel companies and put it intentionally in other places where they thought would be more socially responsible. And Syracuse University is is really probably one of the biggest universities in the United States anyway, or I guess internationally even, that has divested fully from fossil fuels. And you can see the chancellor of Syracuse at the bottom there, a quote from him saying, formalizing our commitment to not invest directly in fossil fuels is one way that they can be stewards and good corporate citizenship and support responsible environmental engagement. Next slide. So then there are several universities that didn't divest completely from fossil fuels, just from coal. And here's some examples of Stanford University and Georgetown University. Both did the coal divestment. Coal is one of the most carbon-intensive methods of energy generation, and other sources can be readily substituted for it. That was the justification of the Stanford president, who endorsed this and was explaining how the university decided that coal they could definitely divest from. And similarly, Georgetown University really picked up, obviously as a Jesuit and Catholic university, they justified their divestment in coal with some both intellectual and spiritual resources that their community is built upon, so that making this kind of ethical justification as well. Next slide. Interestingly, there were of the universities that did coal and oil sands divestment. University of California, the whole UC system, just recently did this and moved a lot, 200 million of their holdings from coal and oil sands companies. And what's interesting about this is that they really were justifying not just on moral grounds, but also that these investments are actually really risky investments due to the lower profitability and the risks associated with stranded assets with both the uncertain future of coal and oil sands. So this is an interesting in that both environmental justification, but also very clearly economic justification for why it actually makes sense financially for them to divest as justification for divestment, which is interesting. But one thing to be noted about University of California or any of these organizations that have divested just from coal or coal and oil sands, but not all fossil fuels, is obviously many in those students and many in the movement are pushing for them to go farther, because UC, for example, still has 10% of its nearly $100 billion investment portfolio in other energy space, probably oil and gas, that is not in this coal and oil sands piece. So that's an important point, is that this is, in some ways seen as like a partial divestment, but not, fully. So next. So then we looked at the universities that, had pressure to divest and felt pressure sufficiently, and they went through some kind of a process for deciding whether or not to actually divest. And these universities or these organizations, 15 of them that we looked at, they all made statements explaining why they were not going to divest. And 10 of the 15 clearly made it fiduciary responsibility, the economic claim that it's not responsible to limit their investments in this way. But there were other justifications as well. Most notably, probably this justification that is an ineffective mechanism for facilitating change. Duke University and Columbia both mentioned that divestment wouldn't necessarily impact the companies, and there wasn't a consensus on campus that this makes sense, so they're not going to go ahead and do that. Brown University mentioned insufficient energy alternatives, and that coal is really necessary for the functioning of the global economy. So they said it doesn't make sense for Brown to divest from coal because coal is critical. MIT was interesting. They've said that they do not want to participate in public shaming, and they think divestment could retard rather than encourage open collaboration. So MIT obviously is a campus that has strong connections with industries of many kinds, and they want to encourage and foster collaboration rather than try to cut off or penalize or shame certain organizations or sectors. And then many of the schools included in their announcement for that they're not going to divest, that they are going to invest rather than divest. So Yale, for example, had a new sustainability initiative that with 21 million in capital investment that they announced in response to the divestment campaign, but they didn't explicitly say why they weren't going to divest. They just said, we are going to do this and do do investments in the direction we want things to go. And similarly, MIT said they want to engage with industry instead of distance themselves from industry, and they're seeking financial support from industry to support some of their research in environment and energy. Next slide. So this economic responsibility argument, the fiduciary responsibility, is interesting because as we saw with the claims could also be made and were being made on the other side that it's actually more responsible to divest because fossil fuel investments are risky investments. So, but obviously the more conventional view is that limits to your investment portfolio in any way, constrain and could hinder your maximizing your returns. So, like here, for example, the University of Vermont, where I am, they had a die-in where students lay on the hall's floor in the academic administration building, calling for divestment. And the University of Vermont has issued a statement saying its primary duty is to invest the endowment to maximize returns and minimize risk and provide funds to support the academic mission of the UVM. And so the divestment doesn't necessarily, they don't see that as part of what their responsibility is. And similarly at Bates, they mention the fiduciary responsibility to protect their ability from generation to generation to offer the high quality liberal arts education that they're focused on. So this is just a clear sense and some specific examples of this responsibility. Next slide. This is just a cartoon saying our investments may be destroying the planet, but we need them to safeguard your future. So that's obviously just characterizing this tension that's emerging in many places. Next slide. So again, the justifications for not divesting. Harvard obviously is a very prominent place, a university that has made one of these statements saying they're not going to divest. And the president said, I do not believe, nor do my colleagues on the corporation, that university divestment from the fossil fuel industry is warranted or wise. And similarly, Swarthmore just said they went back into history, historical decision to say that the board adopted a policy in 1991 saying our endowment shouldn't be used to take positions on social issues, so that therefore they want to be consistent with that. So that was their justification. Next slide. I'm almost done, and we can open it up for discussion. Here, I just wanted to highlight that as I said, several of the universities that say they're not going to divest have intentionally offered up and committed to investing in new initiatives that will, and here's an example of Williams College. The president very explicitly said, we will invest, not divest, right? And make the point that we can have potentially more impact by being in favor of and investing in the direction we want things to go, rather than divesting from fossil fuels. And similarly, Middlebury College mentions their new focus on clean energy, green building, and other efforts that they are going to increase the amount of their endowment that goes toward those efforts, and that's part of their response to the divestment pressure to divest. Instead, they're going to invest differently. So next. Here are just some other examples of universities that are some of the specific actions, the specific investments of those that were not choosing not to divest. Different funds are created, different capital investments in different energy conservation initiatives, and different strategies on the campuses in different ways. Next slide. So if you just to wrap up here, and we can open it up for discussion, this is a dynamic landscape, and more there will the sense is that there's a lot of the pressure is continuing to grow on campuses and in other organizations, and there's potential for a lot more of these announcements coming up. Next slide. And I guess I just return to reminding you all that how this fossil fuel divestment movement really is disruptive, and it is very threatening. And as it grows, it also creates, potentially more of a threat. But we should, there's this kind of attention and this kind of disruptive and really makes some campuses quite uncomfortable, right? The discussions and the protests on campus with the administration versus the students, it is uncomfortable and disruptive, and that's part of what's going on here. Next. Here are just a few other cartoons that I came across. The one on the top, just the resistance from the fossil fuel industry and those who it's easy to criticize the fossil fuel divestment movement as impractical, and that we need fossil fuels. That, I guess that's the point of that article. I mean, that cartoon. And then the cartoon on the bottom here is just the Rockefellers are divesting from fossil fuels, and the coal, gas, and oil, especially the oil, saying, "Oh, some people are just fair weather friends," because obviously they had strong connections previously with fossil fuels. Next slide. And so I'll just end there, and we can take questions and suggestions. Oops. Because obviously this is preliminary research, and we've just started to, look at these different universities and how they're responding. But the energy landscape in general is really changing quickly, and the conventional rules and assumptions may be ineffective. This is a photograph that my colleague Didac Ferrar often uses to just demonstrate that, if you play the same game with the same rules, as when the landscape changes, it may not work at all, right? So it would be really hard to play soccer on this soccer field on a tilted landscape. But the fossil fuel divestment movement is very dynamic. It's really growing in momentum. And it's part of a destabilization of the whole fossil regime that is occurring. And I guess I'll just end also with this. If you haven't yet, as the momentum grows, the fossil fuel interests are getting defensive and potentially even more defensive, and trying to counter the movement with advertisements extolling the benefits of fossil fuels and calling the fuel activists anti-energy activists. And I think resistance and kind of the fighting back from the fossil fuel industry could get more intense before it kind of subsides, because we're really in the middle here. So if you haven't yet watched this cute little video, I won't actually try to do it with this group because of the technological challenges, but if you're interested, I think it's just a minute long. It's a fossil fuel industry supported Valentine's Day video that's called "Breaking Up with Fossil Fuels is Hard to Do." And they explain, the cartoon kind of goes through about why fossil fuels are so critical, and explains how life would be if we just stopped using fossil fuels right now, and how uncomfortable and we wouldn't be functioning properly. So it's again putting a counter narrative to the fossil fuel divestment campaign. Next slide. And that's it. I just wanted to thank Elizabeth Palchuk, my graduate student, who's really done the bulk of this work, and this will be part of her PhD thesis, and the rest of my energy climate transitions research team at the University of Vermont. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jenny. That was really interesting. So I guess now we'll do some questions. I just wanted to reiterate the instructions to do that. It doesn't look like anyone currently has their microphone active. So if you do want to ask a question by microphone, You can do that by clicking the little headset icon on the top left-hand corner, or you can post a question in the chat thing, which Danny has just done. Jenny, you can see the chat, right?
Yes. Yep.
So I will. Also, if you want to ask a question, you can put up your hand virtually by clicking that little hand icon underneath the chat window and changing your thing to hand. And then I'll unmute you. But if you add your microphone, I'll just leave it unmuted since I think it'd be easier that way. So yeah, feel free to ask Jenny all the questions you have.
So James, there's a question by Danny that's posted. Do you want to read it, and I can respond to it, or can everyone see that question? I don't know how it works.
We do have one person that called in, so I'll just read it out loud, and then that person will be able to see it or hear it. Okay, so Danny says, thank you, Jenny, for a fascinating presentation. This is interesting and important work. My question is, how has the declining global price of fossil fuels affected the movement? The timeline that you presented captures this period of turbulence for fossil fuel companies, particularly in their unconventional upstream investments. It would strike me as interesting to see how this landscape change affected the movement, and you have a before and after element already captured, although there are complex influences here, including momentum for Paris, the Pope's moral argument, and so forth. Your thoughts?
Yeah. So great question. Obviously, there's a lot of different things going on at the same time over the past couple of years. And the declining price of fossil fuels, there's lots of ways to interpret that and to think about how that's contributed to kind of slowing down the renewable energy transition potentially, and how it's contributed to keeping us hooked on fossil fuels, right? As people are, and so it definitely does contribute, because many of us can't imagine our lives without fossil fuels, right? We rely on them so deeply that it's hard to imagine without. And the low price of fossil fuels has only encouraged and increased in many places our reliance on fossil fuels. So that's definitely a piece of the story. I think let's see what else you mentioned in terms of very interesting. I mean, there are lots of ways this could be explored in connection with other events that are going on. You mentioned Paris and the Pope's moral arguments, and there's and also obviously the fracking boom, right? Which is also having a huge impact on the low price and the availability of fossil fuels. So there's a lot going on, and a lot of and the kind of absolute fossil fuel divestment movement of kind of this recognizing how hard it is, and that's almost why they're pushing for divestment, because if you don't intentionally divest, we will probably, we're in this cycle of perpetuating and continuing our fossil fuel reliance. So there are lots of interesting questions there for sure. So thank you.
Any other questions? Well, I have a question while everyone thinks of their questions. Jenny, I'm going to use my moderator power here and just go back to this slide. What does the vertical axis in this slide mean? Is that something like the scale of their portfolio or something, or?
No, so there is no significance. This is just a timeline,
Okay.
and then we've just spread them out based on timing and fitting in the text. So at this point, but that's a good idea. We could and should think about if there's a way to capture the amount of money potentially, or the impact of that statement on the potentially we could integrate that into this too. This is really, it just is a timeline, and it kind of evolved as we were working on it, and we kept, things kept being added. So we realized, we should just have a timeline that we can continue to update. Yeah.
Okay, well, that actually, I did have a follow-up question then. I see we're getting a couple questions in the chat thing too, so I'll be quick. So my follow-up question was about the scale of the divestment or lack of divestment relative to the association or the organization's like overall portfolio. Do you have that information? Is it public or?
Yeah, so I think there has been some others looking at that. We haven't yet pulled that all together consistently, but obviously that's part of the picture here to kind of get a sense. And it depends. Different organizations have different levels of what the impact is on their and that portfolio. So I think there's quite a range, but I don't have specifics to give you right now. Yeah.
Okay, well, that's great. No, thank you. It's
yeah,
it's interesting for sure. So we do have a couple more questions here.
Yep.
Sasha writes, how do you envision a justice-based green energy transition, and what would be the role of reinvestment in creating that?
Yeah, great question. I actually, another research project I'm working on has to do with the renewable energy transition as a more inclusive and diverse energy sector. Right now, the energy sector is very conventional and really staffed primarily by white men. And so gender diversity and broadening the opportunities for for jobs in the renewable energy sector. There's a lot of opportunities for that, and there's a lot of opportunities for one of the value of fossil fuels is that with renewable energy, it's a lot more distributed. Communities and households and individuals can be more involved in their energy systems. And so in terms of a justice-based green energy transition, I see the renewable energy transition as having huge potential for kind of democratization and it being much more inclusive and spreading the benefits of the energy sector, because we're all reliant on energy, but we shouldn't necessarily have these very few centralized companies that profit and the rest of us scramble to pay them. There's with renewable energy moving away from fossil fuels, there's lots of opportunities for different and more just energy futures.
Okay, thanks, Jenny. Another question from Diane. I am concerned that the divestment movement is oversimplistic and assumes that North America and European investment is all that there is. I suspect that if there are no viable alternatives, particularly for the developing world, we will just see more and more investment from China and other pragmatic countries to displace the investment from US and European organizations. This is what's happening in Nigeria and other places. Is your group doing any work to assess unintended consequences of divestment?
Yeah, so that is a great question, and it has to do with a lot of, it has to do with justice issues also, and the distribution of the impact of focusing attention on any one particular place, and this whole idea of, if you think about greenhouse gas emissions, the leakage with other places, obviously even with moving pressure with the fossil fuel industry moving to other places. We haven't explored this explicitly yet, but I think as the divestment movement grows, that influence and potential for calling out, a lot of these corporations are global and multinational, obviously, so they can still go to other markets and find places to sell their fossil fuels, but there's also I think the impact from the movement in North America and Europe can have a larger impact potentially, I mean, I think you're right in terms of oversimplification. It's it's a start, I guess, and I think there's it can expand beyond that, and if it's synergistic with other initiatives, right, that are thinking about how things are being distributed globally.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jenny. Looks like we have another question from Jordan. Excuse me. Oh, one thing. If you do want to ask a question by audio, I made the hand icons actually underneath the participant list, not under the chat window, in case you couldn't find. Okay, Jordan asks, I found the movement by some universities and organizations toward investment without actively participating in divestment quite interesting. I sometimes wonder if such responses are more sustainable and responsible than pure divestment, as it is quite true, as the little video illustrates, that many of the materials and products that we extract from different forms of fossil fuels cannot be replaced at this point in time. However, I think there is quite a difference between using fossil fuels for manufacturing and energy. Are the terms being employed on both sides of the argument too generally? Does any resulting confusion in the public sphere hamper progress toward a future where sustainable energy solutions are used in greater abundance or completely than traditional fossil fuel solutions? Oh, and he or she adds clarification. By investment, I mean in sustainable energy.
Okay. I think what you've picked up on here is obviously this similar kind of concern about the simplification. Like, we can't cut off fossil fuels immediately, right? And I think that's a clear reality and practicality that I think that then can be converted into, well, then the fossil fuel divestment movement is somehow hypocritical or impractical or that kind of thing. And I think there's, I think that's a fair position to have. But I think there's also, I think with any movement, there's I guess they're different, and this is actually another thing that my research in other areas points out, is that different people have different sense of radical versus incremental change and the time horizon within which people are thinking about the future. So if if you're thinking about next week or the next month, and how are you going to survive without fossil fuels, you're going to be disillusioned and frustrated and think we can't go to a fossil fuel free future. But if you're able to have a longer term time horizon and you want to work toward that, and the fossil fuel divestment movement can be a strategic tool or mechanism to encourage people to think about that possibility and how our day-to-day investments or choices do actually perpetuate our current system. And if we really want to move to a different system, we need to acknowledge that some other things need to happen. So let's see. I think you're right that there is confusion in the public sphere about all of this, and part of it has to do with time horizon and how today impact the future 10 or 20 years ago from now. And we all have different perspectives and different capacities or different ways of thinking about the future and how what we do now impacts the future. So I think a lot of it, the confusion could really be related to that time horizon. If you kind of assume the future is going to be very similar to the way it is now, and that we aren't going to have other things that are going to cause disruptions and really going to force us away from fossil fuels, then that's what I shouldn't generalize, but a lot of society does assume that the future 10 or 20 years will be quite similar to what it is right now. But when we see how quickly the energy landscape is actually changing, and how disruptions within electric utilities and disruptions with rooftop solar, and there's a lot happening, I think, quicker than people realize, and the potential for really deeper change is there. And I think some of this is the divestment movement can really be synergistic with some of that. So I don't know if that directly answered your question, but I think I touched on parts of it for sure.
Okay, thanks, Jenny. Are there any other questions? Well, I have one more quick one.
Yep.
Do you know if the discourse that you're finding around divestment or investment, how does it compare to the movement with tobacco in the 80s and 90s at all?
Yeah. I guess I just have a few probably comments to make about that. I haven't looked explicitly, we haven't looked explicitly back at the tobacco language, but I think there definitely are some similarities. But there's and I think many of you may have heard just the past couple of weeks, the new investigative reporting that revealed that Exxon Mobil had in-house scientists, climate scientists, that had confirmed kind of anthropogenic climate change. Yet they were and being very proactive in their communication publicly to deny and move away, confuse the public about that issue, is very analogous to obviously what went on with tobacco. But I don't know enough about the tobacco divestment campaign to know really about how the framing and the justifications for it. But I would imagine that a lot of the similar with any divestment movement, I think a lot of the similar kinds of arguments do emerge, right? That we have to have this responsibility for maximizing profits, and that we can't police or try to monitor the impacts of all of those investments, right? And that it's a complicated landscape, and that organizations don't necessarily have that responsibility to do that. So that's an interesting analogy for sure, that could definitely be explored more explicitly.
Thanks, Jenny. Okay, I think maybe we'll do one more question. We've got one from Jordan here, and then we'll wrap it up, because we were shooting for an hour and we're getting pretty close to that. So Jordan has a follow. I don't know if it's a follow-up or not, but anyhow, writes, has your research touched on where or not there has been an increase in the availability of personal investment portfolios that are socially responsible? For example, at the Royal Bank of Canada, only one option exists, which is, I guess, the Yancey SRI.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So my graduate student who's doing this work on the fossil fuel divestment campaign, she actually works at the University of Vermont for the socially responsible investing committee of the university. And so she's very involved in making a lot of these connections with more general socially responsible investing options and the fossil fuel divestment movement. One interesting thing that happened at the University of Vermont is that an alumni wanted to donate a whole lot of money to the university, and they've created in response a fossil fuel free fund for that purpose, because the person who's donating wanted it to be a fossil free, didn't want to contribute money to a general fund. And so that's one response in terms of an option for a university. But the question was really about individual choice and investment portfolios that individuals have. And I think there is an increase in the availability of fossil fuel free personal investment options, and that's growing kind of alongside this movement and as part of it. So I think there's definitely connections and that's also where, if you remember, we mentioned the 3 phases of divestment movement as it gets into the kind of the mainstream, and really a lot of people and organizations maybe wanting to have that option. More and more of those alternatives are emerging. Yeah.
Okay, great. All right. Well, thank you, Jenny, again for the great presentations. Very interesting. It's not something I knew a whole lot about, so I was very interested to learn more about what universities are or are not doing, and the excuses they come up with for doing it. I'd also like to thank everybody that's still on the line for participating in ONCEP's first webinar. I think it went pretty smoothly, but I'll send a follow-up email to everybody in case there was any kind of technical glitches or anything. I believe that we've recorded the presentation, which we will try to make available on our website afterwards, which is, in case you haven't seen it, www.onsep or onsep.org. Once again, thanks to Jenny, and I will hope to see you in a future ONCEP Talking Sustainable Energy webinar.
Great. Well, thank you very much.
Thanks.
It was fun.